House has voted to overturn President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada.
Some news now from south of the border and some breaking news that we are tracking. The U.S. House has voted against U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada.
Power rarely announces itself with explosions. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a trade letter, 5 bullet points, and a quiet warning that an entire economic relationship could unravel. That is exactly what just happened in North America. 5 demands from Washington, 1 trade agreement hanging in the balance, and a response from Canada that caught the United States completely off guard. This is not just another tariff dispute, it is a test of sovereignty inside one of the most integrated economic systems in the world. And what unfolded reveals how quickly leverage collapses when both sides depend on each other more than they admit. The United States, under Donald Trump's trade leadership, presented Canada with 5 clear conditions tied to the future of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known in Ottawa as CUSMA. The message was simple: accept these terms or risk renewed tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, and energy. The list targeted Canada's dairy system, digital media laws, provincial alcohol rules, government procurement policies, and aspects of energy regulation. On paper, it looked like a pressure campaign. In practice, it exposed Washington's own vulnerabilities. Mark Carney, now acting as Canada's chief economic strategist in this confrontation, did not counteroffer. He did not stall. He rejected every demand. To some observers, that looked reckless. The U.S. economy is far larger. American consumer markets dwarf Canada's. But Carney's calculation was rooted in something deeper than size. It was rooted in integration. North America no longer operates as 3 separate economies trading across clean borders. It functions as a tightly woven production network. Auto parts cross borders multiple times before a vehicle is finished. Energy grids are interconnected. Agricultural supply chains are synchronized. Disrupt one strand, and the entire system vibrates. The auto industry illustrates the point. Notably, autos were not included among the 5 official demands. That omission speaks volumes. The North American auto sector is one of the most interconnected manufacturing ecosystems on Earth. General Motors executives have warned lawmakers that breaking continental supply chains would cost tens of billions of dollars and destabilize production. Tariffs in this sector would not punish one side. They would ricochet across factories in Michigan, Ontario, and beyond. Energy tells an even clearer story. The United States imports nearly 4 million barrels of Canadian crude oil every day. Gulf Coast refineries are designed specifically for Canada's heavy crude. Switching to lighter domestic oil would require expensive retooling. Meanwhile, during winter peaks, parts of New England depend heavily on Canadian hydropower to stabilize the grid. Energy flows in both directions, but dependence runs deeper than political rhetoric suggests. Carney understood this arithmetic. Tearing up the trade pact would not simply punish Canada. It would send immediate shockwaves through American fuel prices, manufacturing costs, and electricity markets. This is not a one-sided dependency. It is mutual exposure. The first flashpoint, dairy, captures the emotional tone of the dispute. American negotiators have long criticized Canada's supply management system, which uses quotas and high tariffs to stabilize farm income. U.S. officials argue that tariffs approaching 300% on overquoted dairy imports are unfair. But the United States heavily subsidizes its own farmers through federal programs worth billions each year. The methods differ, but both countries protect agriculture. Carney declared supply management untouchable. Speaking directly to Quebec's rural base, he made clear that dismantling dairy protections was politically impossible. Canada had already passed legislation reinforcing supply management, locking it into statute. By narrowing his own flexibility, Carney strengthened his negotiating position. If the policy is law, it cannot be casually traded away. The second battle sits in the digital sphere. Washington demanded that Canada repeal its Online Streaming Act and Online News Act. These laws require large digital platforms to invest part of their Canadian revenue into local content and compensate publishers when distributing journalistic work. From the American perspective, these measures disproportionately affect U.S. tech giants like Netflix, Google, and Meta. But Canada frames the issue as cultural sovereignty. Digital markets scale globally, and American platforms dominate. Without guardrails, Canadian media and cultural industries risk being drowned out by sheer algorithmic reach. Digital distribution costs little once content exists. Hollywood productions flood smaller markets instantly, while local creators shoulder full production costs for a limited audience. Canada's laws attempt to rebalance that asymmetry. Here lies the contradiction in Washington's stance. At home, U.S. regulators pursue antitrust actions against big tech, arguing these companies suppress competition. Abroad, American trade officials defend those same firms aggressively, demanding foreign governments remove regulations. Carney rejected that contradiction outright. Canada would not dismantle laws channeling hundreds of millions into domestic journalism and culture in exchange for temporary relief from tariff threats. The third demand targeted provincial alcohol rules, particularly in Ontario and British Columbia. These provinces had imposed restrictions in response to earlier U.S. tariffs. Washington insisted Canada lift its retaliatory measures even while American tariffs remained in place. The imbalance was obvious. Remove U.S. tariffs and Canadian countermeasures would disappear. Asking for unilateral concessions signaled something else, a test of submission. Carney refused. Accepting that condition would have established a precedent where the United States could impose penalties at will while expecting compliance in return. No sovereign government could operate under those terms without inviting further pressure. The fourth and fifth demands, changes to procurement and energy policy, cut closer to industrial strategy. U.S. negotiators argued Canadian government purchasing rules favored domestic suppliers and that certain energy regulations distorted cross-border trade. But government procurement is a strategic tool used by many nations to support domestic industry. And when it comes to energy, the flow north to south remains dominant. American refineries and power grids rely on Canadian inputs far more consistently than the reverse. By placing all five demands on the table at once, Washington unintentionally revealed its own pressure points. Dairy matters politically, but energy matters structurally. Digital platforms matter financially, but continental manufacturing matters systemically. Carney's rejection signaled confidence that American industries would eventually push back against their own government if trade tensions escalated too far. That is the core wager. Auto manufacturers, oil refiners, tech firms, and business associations understand the costs of disruption. Congress understands the electoral consequences of spiking fuel prices or factory layoffs. Integration limits how far threats can travel before they boomerang. Markets are already watching. Energy traders monitor flows. Manufacturers run contingency plans. Investors calculate risk premiums tied to policy instability. The louder the rhetoric becomes, the more visible the interdependence appears. This confrontation is not about bruised egos. It is about how power operates inside integrated economies. The United States assumes market size provides ultimate leverage. Canada argues that supply chain interdependence creates shared vulnerability. Both are partly right, but in a system this intertwined, dominance is less decisive than reliability. Carney's response was not dramatic. It was disciplined. Reject the demands. Preserve domestic policy. Force the conversation back onto mutual cost. In doing so, he shifted the burden of escalation onto Washington. So now the question is not whether Canada blinked, it is whether the United States fully understands the system it is threatening to disrupt. Can Washington afford to weaponize trade when its own industries are woven tightly into continental networks? And if integration cuts both ways, who truly holds the stronger hand? North America is discovering that leverage inside a shared economic ecosystem is far more fragile than it looks on paper.